First of all, I have to thank the organizers to ask me to come here and give this prestigious lecture to all of you. Thank you for coming. I have to apologize that I have to speak English. I hope it will be okay. If you do not understand me, I ask you to interrupt me. I can always speak slower or explain things. And this is not the first time I'm in Brno. I have been in this museum before, and I have had other meetings earlier. So this is actually a continuation of some kind of collaboration that has been growing between this department and the university in Brno in general, and our particular center. As Veronica was saying, this is the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities. And then you may ask, what is that? It is an interdisciplinary center, right? So we have people from all kinds of disciplines. There is philosophers, there is people that have done literature studies, there's people who have done biochemistry, there's people who have done fishery science, and I don't know really, there is all kinds of backgrounds, statistics, mathematics, it's all kinds of people there. And so one of the things that we have become famous, or maybe infamous for, I'm not sure, is that many of us have been using a framework of understanding science that is called the post-normal view of science. And I will tell you more about that a little bit later in the lecture, okay? I will also tell you that if you have questions on the way, short questions, we can do that during the lecture. If you want to discuss, hopefully we can have time after that, okay? So don't be afraid to interrupt me, and I hope also that you guys who are sitting far in the back that you can participate and hear everything that I'm saying. So the topic I chose for that one is related to science advice to governments. Now, you may ask, why? Well, one of the things in our philosophy, at least, that we think science is for is that we are serving a public, or we are doing a public service, really. We want, in doing science, and that includes social science and the humanities, we think we have a social call to be part of, contributing to issues that are out there in society. And partially that can be done through education in disciplines, partially an education in interdisciplinary research. And of course, we want to contribute to research as such, so we publish and in relevant journals and all of that. But basically, we also think that we should go out and we should interact with the users of knowledge. And some of the most important users are actually people in power. It's not only business, but it's also political ministries or politicians that have to make decisions on sometimes very important issues. And as Veronica has been saying, I have been involved in several on these issues. On the European level, I was part of a report to the Commissioner on food from the oceans, and I have been part in other, I can show you another report later, making sense of science. But I've also been doing this in my country, in Norway. Actually, I must tell you that if you wonder my name, I'm originally from Germany, okay? So I'm an immigrant, a refugee and an immigrant in Norway, and I've been there for a long time. But I'm at the University of Bergen, and that is where we are working. And now, how do we conceive of this task to give advice, to help politics, to help politicians, parliaments in their decision making. One of the fallacies, the old ideology that we do not share, is this ideology that says scientists speak truth to power. This is something that really doesn't work. And why, I hope it becomes clearer in the end, but this is at least simplified. And I don't know if you have any clear notion what the final truth is on all these important issues that need to be discussed. We don't. But I come back to these issues. Let me just say that there are, in principle, at least as I see it, 4 big challenges when we want to use our expertise, our knowledge, and give science advice. The one I call the holistic challenge. And that is basically that most of the issues that are relevant in political contexts are not issues where we can use one discipline or the other discipline alone. These are issues where we have to combine the knowledge from wide fields. And that includes, for most of the issues, the social sciences and humanities. As we very often see that in many countries, and I don't know about Czechia, but very often the people that are consulted are technical experts that come from the natural sciences or from the engineering. But typically, the advice that will be given is far too narrow to cover the real problems. So what we need is really a more radical interdisciplinarity, and radical that is not only different departments under chemistry working together, but really reaching out to humanities, to social sciences, to law and psychology and other faculties to find the adequate combination of knowledge. So this is one thing. And the claim that I have, and I think that we have at least experience in Norway and probably also here, is internally, we in science, in universities, we are not really prepared for that. Radical interdisciplinarity is something that people talk about during Sunday talks, but in practice, it's not easy. I don't know, but I have an impression that many of you are working on a PhD or maybe postdoc, and you will have to think about your career. And that is typically done that you publish in very narrow fields, in very narrow journals. Because as soon as you start to work interdisciplinary, it's becoming difficult. And your careers are much more uncertain. Luckily, this is about to change in many places. We see that this is now much more recognized, that we need this type of interdisciplinarity in many ways, not only for the science advice, but also in other areas. But it's still, we have to work on that. Each university has a big task to work on that and prepare the ground, prepare new fora like this to actually engage in interdisciplinary discussions. The other one is what I call the pragmatic challenge, and that is the way we communicate. What we are trained in and what you are trained in as scientists is really a very specific way of communication. And as you will see, the recipients of that knowledge, the politicians or parliamentarians or others, they very often need another way of communication. They need different kind of information, and we are not ready to engage in that dispute. And typically, it starts with very simple things, like the amount of time that you spend. We would like to give a lecture to the politicians, but no politician has time to sit in for a whole lecture. They said, okay, you have 5 minutes, tell me, right? And this is a challenge for most of us, right? And to have these things. Anyway, I come back to that. And then there is what I call the post-normal challenge, and I will explain this post-normality a little bit later. And that is typically what you publish is things you feel relatively certain about or that you think you found out, some positive results, right? Sort of knowledge, positive knowledge. But for people who have to make a decision, a very practical decision in a practical context, they need more. They need to know what we do not know as well. Where are the uncertainties? What is in there? Another thing that you are trained, very many of you are trained in, is that stick to the facts, describe reality, right? And then leave out values. However, basically in most of the fields, values and facts are intertwined. And this has to come up also in our policy advice. And we also have to realize that it's not only, we are not the only people that sort of reign over knowledge. There are other people out there in society who have different sources of knowledge. There are professionals, practitioners. There are, for example, also indigenous people. There is all kind of knowledge sources. I will come back to that. And we need to assess the quality of the knowledge. So when I say, forget about the truth, what I want you to be aware of is actually the quality of our knowledge. And quality means being fit for purpose. For the knowledge is that good enough to answer certain questions. Sometimes knowledge that has a lot of uncertainty can be really good and helpful. Sometimes not so much. It depends. But we have to understand the context. So this is the post-normal challenge. And finally, there is the trust challenge. And that is that there are threats to that. And this is not only coming from the outside, from presidents of the United States, or from Brexit people, or other people, or populist movements. The threats are also within the sciences. We have to be reflexive and have to maybe realize that we do not have all the things that it takes. We are actually, in many areas, in a little bit of a crisis, and I will say more about that. So context and historical reflection is required. So this is something that maybe, I guess, you have also been made aware of, that these are the big challenges that come from the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you can take any of these here, and life underwater is one of the things that our university is charged with in particular, but as if you really go into this, there are many indicators and tasks under that. Each of them is very complex. They're never really carved out very specifically. They embrace much larger issues. They are what Rittel and Weber in 1973 called wicked problems. That is, that they are the kind of problems where you can try to answer them, but you don't know if you really have got the answer. So the problem formulation and the answers are sort of always in a movement, right? So there is no final answer. There is only, a step ahead, maybe. There is no truth or falsity, but there is only better or worse. And a lot of that will remain as a patchwork and value-laden partiality. So this is what we see as deep-seated complexity in the issues, right? The complexity does not mean that it's complicated. Complicated means just that there are many things to investigate. The complexity is really that these things are so entangled that there is no clear path to a solution, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's hard to predict, and all of this. So this doesn't come out really. So the interdisciplinarity, how is that done in practice? I don't know about your research projects, but typically, for example, in the European Union, what they do is they have they talk about interdisciplinary or integrated research, and then they have one leg for the hard sciences, the technical expertise, and then they say, oh, let's do something on the soft sciences as well, and they run this in parallel. What we would like to see is really a more co-production of knowledge where stakeholders or society and the soft and the hard sciences, and I put this in quotation marks because I don't believe that any science is harder or softer than the others. Anyway, we can discuss this maybe later on, but this is what we would like to see. So, and then there is, as I was talking about, the ambiguity, the pragmatic challenge. Now, in science, we are not used to very easy or clear-cut answers. There was this, and typically we have these things like, oh, on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. This is when, I think it was President Nixon who was asked once about his science advice, and he said, oh yes, I want to have a one-armed science advisor because I don't want to hear anybody says on the one hand and on the other. He just wants the one hand, okay? So this is what we do, and then we have a myriad of relevant factors, and typically people come up and say, oh yes, this is important, but we need to do more research. That is not good enough in most cases, right? We need to have answers very quickly, very soon. We cannot wait for long research projects. And we cannot really predict futures either. In most of the cases, we are poorly equipped to come up with equipment. So the decision maker wants no ambiguity. They want clarity. And they typically ask us, give me a single number. We need the answers now. And then you can't predict. We pay you to predict, right? So what else are you good for? So here we see a clash of different expectations in the communication. And somehow we need to overcome this. So we realize the task, but we struggle with the performance. And typically what is done, when it is done at all, is we add humanities and social science as an appendix to all the rest. The important things come first, they give numbers and all of that, and then they say, oh yes, and then there are some social aspects, and we need the people to accept genetically modified food or whatever, right? And then this is the social science perspective. But as I said, we need a co-production from the beginning. So what is the context? Why is that important? Well, I guess in your country, as in most other, at least European countries and many of the modern or industrialized countries, we hear people talking about, oh, we want to do politics that is evidence-based politics. Evidence-based politics. Now, that is wrong on many counts, because you need more than evidence to do politics. At best, you can hope for evidence-informed politics, evidence-informed policies. But what we very often find in many countries is the opposite. They are not really asking for the evidence and then to design the politics after that. What they want is policy-based evidence. That is, they have a policy and they say, oh, give us the scientific arguments how we can support this, right? So there is a clash, and we need to overcome that as well. I mean, to tell the people, no, sorry, science is not for window dressing, and we should not do these errands, run after the money, because sometimes there is money in that, but, keep our integrity, and I come back to integrity later. So, and how do we do that? Let's say we enter into such a context. What role do we play? There is a lot of talk about objectivity, the scientist that has to be the objective source for knowledge. Well, There's much to be said about that, and I would argue that's not totally wrong, at least in the sense if we understand objectivity as something that is balanced, where we provide both pro and con arguments for certain positions. We scan the literature or the research and we find what is this evidence for, or what is that evidence for, and we can try to provide this picture. And we can also, on the basis of the knowledge that we have, on the basis of our theories, maybe come up with some future scenarios. We cannot predict the future. And most of these areas where it's important, we have to admit there is no way we can predict how the societies will be dealing with energy issues in 20 years from now, or even, we can have that as a strategic goal in politics, but how it will be done, we don't know. There are so many things happening, it's far too complex to have predictions. But we can at least have some future scenarios that can help us do our planning. So this is the traditional role as the academic. But it's not the only role. Many of the academics, and I would say maybe particularly in the environmental field, act not as the typical scholar, but they act as advocate. They do advocacy, right? They want to save the sharks, for example, right? And that's the goal. And then they have to convince the policymakers that it's worthwhile saving the sharks, because if they don't think about the sharks, nobody else will do it, right? So, and I would say these are very different roles, and I can see a place for both of them. It is not wrong, even as a scientist, to be an advocate for certain things. The only thing that is wrong is when you don't make that clear, that when you mix up these roles, when you pretend to be the objective or balanced scholar, but basically you are the advocate. I think we have to keep these roles separate, and then that can be very helpful. But this is what I see very often a dilemma for science advice to governments. Furthermore, that we can see that the research process is really, it's a complicated thing. You can see here, this is just a very schematic framework here. It starts with the problem and then planning the research. The problem and its framing. This is where all it starts. What actually is the problem? And whose problem are we going to solve? There is, I don't know if you are familiar with the famous statistical type 1 and type 2 fallacies, the false positive and the false negative. There is a saying that there is a type 3 fallacy also, and the type 3 fallacy would be, oh, it's very good science, really top science, but altogether the wrong problem. Unfortunately, that happens very often, that scientists redefined a complex issue into something that they can answer within the limits of their narrow discipline, right? But that is not necessarily the answer to the issue. How to feed the world in 2050 with 10 billion people, you go out and you ask people in, for example, that I've worked with aquaculture, and they come up and they say, oh, yes, we have to build more aquaculture systems all around the world, right? That is not really the problem. That is, they translate this into more seafood. And in this way, you can see how people redefine problems so that they can come up with the answers. But the problems out there are very different. They have to do with the distribution of food and all other things, and food cultures, and all of this. So this is already the first problem. The problem. Who defines it? Whose problem are we going to solve? And in order to make sure that there is a good problem formulation, we need to involve stakeholders. We need to involve citizens, others than the experts. We need to involve more people than people in our discipline. Planning the research. It has to do what I mentioned earlier, interdisciplinarity. Who is going to do what, right? And who is in charge of it? doing the research, which has a lot of actual questions, also ethical questions, how are we going to go about this? Quality assurance, I come back to that, and application and monitoring. So, what we do is we apply this post-normal framework. Has any of you heard about post-normal science before? Can you just, those who have? Don't be afraid, I'm not, you have. 2, 3. Okay, it's better I give a short presentation. Now, I wouldn't even describe it as a philosophy of science. It's an observation that goes back to these two guys. This is Silvio Fontowicz, originally from Argentina. He is in Italy now, and he lives in Italy most of the time, but he works with us in Bergen also most of the time. He's retired, but when he works with us. And this is Jerry Roberts, a friend of his. They together wrote this. Jerry Roberts is now had his 90th birthday. He lives in England. And this was one of the first PhDs that was done, Jeroen van der Sluis from the Netherlands, but he's also with us in Bergen now working on these things. So the post-normal science has this, four characteristics. That it's science for policy, and typically the stakes are high. What is at stake is important. The facts are uncertain. The values are in dispute, and still the decisions are urgent. Now, they have this picture here, which has been subject to a lot of discussions, but this is applied normal science. Now, what I normally do in the teaching, I use an example. Imagine we have to build a water dam, right? Because politicians say, oh, here, Brno needs more electricity. There is, growth in the city, we need more electricity, and the energy sources are too poor, and maybe there is a water reservoir up in a certain valley. I don't know where that would be here, but somewhere in the mountains, and yes, we'll have a water dam built here. So we build that. Now, typically, you would give that task to some engineers, and they would work with a certain level of uncertainty. That is, they would use their physical theory to, for example, calculate how strong you have to have this, the concrete wall that dams the water, right? And how it's bending and all of this. And because it's known that sometimes the quality of the concrete can be different or the work cannot be so perfect, they always operate with a margin of error. That's typical for an engineer. There's a certain margin of error. Because if the dam breaks, there will be lives lost down the valley, okay? These are the stakes for the typical engineer. Now, but that is only the first phase. What we know is that's not so easy. Typically, and we have examples in Norway and many other countries, what happens is then that it's not only those engineers that are building the dam. All of a sudden, there comes a guy from, let's say, ecology or, biology, and he says, oh, you can't, in our country, for example, people who would say that, oh, you cannot build a water dam here through this valley because this is where the reindeer move from the winter to the north, grassing area, right? So they are dependent on this path here. You cannot interrupt that. And then there comes a historian, medieval historian or whatever, or cultural historian, says you cannot build a dam here because there is an old graveyard in the church down there, and this is a really sacred place. It has been for many people for a long time. This is a cultural inheritance. We cannot just, wipe it out with a water dam. So, and there are many other experts or different types of knowledge, that come in here. So this is the professional judgment, and that can be, they are arguing from different perspectives, and they will have, there's a conflict coming up. So all of a sudden, the stakes are higher because we realize we might disturb the natural life we might disturb cultural inheritance and all of that. So the stakes are higher, and the uncertainties are also higher. But that's not all. In most of these issues, for example, even with this water dam, then people come up and say, hey, why do we need to build a dam in the first place? This is about energy, right? And what we need is not just to, serve the people down there in Brno and they're crying out for more energy. What we should do is educate them to use less energy. That is the way to go. So this here is the post-normal science area. All of a sudden we realize how the facts and the values are more intertwined, and we ask some very basic principled questions about the whole enterprise. And there is much larger uncertainty and also much larger stakes, right? So basically it's about a future, what kind of future do we want, and all of this. And you can see this in all kinds of debates. Climate change, of course, right? You can see this in food developments. How do we provide more food? You can see this in mobility studies, in all kinds of other areas. So this is the complexity that I've been talking about. Facts and values become intertwined, but still, and all the facts are, in principle, if we look into it, are uncertain. I mean, do the reindeer really need to go through this valley or not? Can they go around it? Uncertain, right? The values are in dispute. How big a value is a churchyard with some old bones, right? Compared to all the people down there who would use electricity? Dispute. But still, we need to make decisions. So this is the post-normal science framework. And we see this as highly relevant for any kind of science that reaches out to policy, to practical applications for very complex issues. So then you can ask, but isn't that just basically making it much more difficult? I mean, if that is so, we should give up, isn't it? Not quite. This is not against science. This is not postmodern or whatever in this sense. It is pro-science still. We need knowledge, but we need to do this in a little bit more sophisticated way, and I can't go into all of this. One thing that is typical for this is when you are in this area here, the notion who is an expert becomes weaker because, as I said, facts and values are intertwined. You cannot do typical peer review and say this is how we take care of the quality of our knowledge. You have to involve stakeholders and basically civil society, because these are questions about values and all of that. What do we want? What kind of futures do we want? And in these areas, all kinds of people are experts or relevant to be consulted, okay? So the notion of expertise becomes something. So therefore, what we want here is what we call extended peer reviews. That is not only the traditional one where we ask our friends and colleagues, but where we really go also outside science, actually first among other scientists, but then even outside science. So we need extended peer review. We need to be more sophisticated about the uncertainties. What kind of uncertainties are we really dealing with? And as I said, typically scientists are not very sophisticated about that. They do, statistical margins of errors, but other than that, they very seldom explicate that. I can give you more examples. That would be another lecture, actually, about how uncertainties very often disappear in these processes, right, in the sciences. So, but there are methods, and people, for example, this guy, Jeroen van der Sluis, and some other people have been working on mapping out the uncertainties so that it becomes clearer. Maybe have a traffic light system, so how we can assess the quality of the knowledge that we have. So this is the framework, okay? Now, as I said, this is going to the science for policy advice. You may think that, that sounds like some philosophers up there in in their ivory tower have made that up. This guy here is called, his name is Sir Peter Gluckman. He was the science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand for 8 years or so, or yeah, something like that, or 9 years. He just stepped down last year. He is now the upcoming president of the International Science Council, and also the president of this network for the International Network for Governmental Science Advice, INGSA. Look that up here on the website. He started a discussion that is now a worldwide discussion, and he said, hey, this old picture of speaking truth to power is nonsense. Whenever our advice was needed for policy, it has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with the post-normal science situation. So, and he actually put that into this framework, which caused many other countries to follow, and actually the European Union immediately woke up, and it started 5 years ago, I think, in Auckland, where he called for a big conference, together with the International Science Council and the EU, and the next conference was in Brussels, like 3 years ago, and then the next one was in Tokyo last year, actually. So I attended 2 of them, but basically he said that what we need to have when we give advice to policy, we have to have this framework, at least in the back of our head, and we have to work on the basis of these insights. Well, I think there are challenges for all the different sciences. Let's say the more traditional natural sciences and others, they have to get away from the standard quality indicators. The peer-reviewed publishing is not necessarily good enough, and I come back to that, why that is the case. And they have to integrate knowledge quality assessments with the uncertainty. In the humanities and the social sciences, we need to be much more sophisticated about talking about values. We do not have a lot of data or trustworthy data on societal values. A lot of people talk about it, and social sciences typically have been, celebrating them as the glue of society or whatever, but we don't really know what the values are out there, really, or the studies that we have a lot of weaknesses. We need to engage in scenario and narratives for the future. I don't know if any of you have worked with scenarios, but scenarios is not just something that you just make up easily, but you have to have a systematic approach how to construct scenarios that are somehow realistic based on where we are. We need to be much more outspoken when it comes to risk studies. Typically, politicians ask about the risk of certain things, the risk of GMOs, for example, genetically modified organisms, and say, oh, let's do a risk assessment. Is it too risky or is it not too risky? In food, this is all about food safety, right? Now, we need to be a little bit more outspoken and say, hey, these are not the only values that come in. It's not only about food safety, it's about a lot of other things. It's about the quality of our natural environment. It's about the living conditions of our farmers. It's about basically how we want to feed ourselves, and all of these aspects. We need to break through the implicit values that are guiding existing risk studies. Typically, what we have been doing in many areas is that we have had some kind of participatory mechanisms in our study. So we have asked, okay, we do something on agriculture, let's ask some farmers. And we do focus groups or maybe interviews. Sometimes we do surveys, right? And all that is good. I'm not against that. The point is, very often it's not good enough. We need to have more different platforms where we have more of a dialogue, where we not only extract information from the people that we get to work with, but we actually learn from them, that we have a dialogue where we can, use sort of these fora for learning from the farmers about their wishes and all of that. Co-construct future. We need what is now called often citizen science, right? So, and then there is this thing that I've been talking about, the need of reflexivity. We need to realize there is an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is basically that our sciences themselves are not really so good as we think they are. We behave as if everything is in order as long as we stay inside the academic house. It's not. There are many things that are wrong. And this is basically the internal, first of all, there is not the trust that from the outside, but this is the lack of reliable quality and the lack of integrity in the sciences that we do. Now, this has been, in recent years, a topic of a lot of discussion. This is here from The Economist, How Science Goes Wrong. This is a book that we published some years ago, I'm not sure when, 3 years ago or so. And basically, what we see is that a lot of the science that we do is basically hunting for certain indicators. We are just trying to maximize the number of publications, for example, maximize the number of citations, quotations, and the impact factor of journals and what have you, right? And these we use as indicators of quality. However, there is what is known as Campbell's law, saying that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. In other words, we are not aiming anymore to the final quality of the result. We are aiming to reach these indicators. We are aiming at as many outputs, as many publications as possible, as many quotations as possible. These become goals in themselves, while they were intended originally to be indicators of the quality of the knowledge that we produce. But that is more or less losing out of sight. What is happening is I can just mention certain things like we know that most of the science that is published is non-reproducible. That is starting in all those areas where people thought it was very important to reproduce results. Let's say medicine, medical research. More than 80%. How much we don't really know, but at least 80% of all the studies can never be reproduced, right? So this is one of the things. People are using significance level, the P factor, as if that is an indicator of a final result. It's not. There is what they call P hacking. You can always modify your statistical results so that you get a significant result out of it. So anyway, what we can see is there is actually a continuum between, in the ethics or integrity of science, between the outright fraud, where people just either fabricate or falsify or plagiarize research in order to promote careers. Now, this is not so often the case, but it happens still. And this is the one end of the continuum, as I would say. But that goes on to the questionable research practices that are threatening also the integrity. The questionable research practices are, I think for most of you, it must be highly relevant. Questions of authorship, for example. Who is a relevant co-author of a paper? How many of you have published already? Can you just give me something that you have published? Yeah, okay. How many of you have published this with your supervisor? Yeah. What you often will realize is, or very often what happens is that the supervisor expects to be mentioned as a co-author. Now, that is not wrong necessarily if the supervisor does really work on that. But it is wrong if the supervisor just uses authority, or if the head of the department uses authority to say, hey, I gave you this scholarship, you better mention me as co-author. And these practices we see a lot of. The same happens with data management, property of data. You collect data, you do something on them, and then all of a sudden they disappear. Maybe some other people take them away from you. We have a lot of experience with that. Or people do research without the proper permission from, let's say, ethics committee or animal welfare committee or what it must be. So these are all questionable research practices. And there is quite something. I have just concluded with a group of colleagues in Norway, the largest study on integrity that we have had so far globally. We have sent out a questionnaire to 31,000 researchers and received answers from 7,300 that gave us a good overview over these issues. And 40% of all the researchers that answered admits that they at least once for the last 3 years have engaged in a practice that you would call questionable research practice, like the authorship issues or data issues. 40% of them, of all ages. So, but that is not all. And then there's a whole bunch of research that I said is just quality deficient. And now I regret that I have not included some slides of a study. I can maybe mention that later on the Boston Cookbook study that shows how quality can fail in spite of being published in peer-reviewed best journals and all of that. So, and then there's of course still good science left, but we can see that there is a whole range of issues where the quality fails. So we need to do something with that in our science. And I don't know, we need to improve these standards for knowledge generation, the standards for science. And how we do this, well, we don't know. We need to work for more transparency in the sciences, for more open science. We have to change the reward system, the assessments, the ethics, and basically we need to talk more about this. We have to have fora where we can talk about the integrity issues. And I also like to cook. I think that the Italian movement of slow food is a very good movement to give you high quality in the food. And I think we should copy that in the sciences as well. We need more slow science to make sure that we really let it boil for some time and reassess before we go out with it. So slow science to deal with that. So there is, as I said, how is the problem framed? We need to make the values explicit. We need to point out the plurality of knowledge claims, and we have to contextualize the input of this, of the knowledge sources. So there's all kinds of knowledges, the academic expertise, professional expertise. NGOs very often have their own expertise on different value issues, indigenous knowledge, and societal groups at large. And we need to acknowledge that in our perspective, which leads to different viewpoints on that. Now, I want to finish this because so far it has been theoretical. It has been an ivory tower sort of overview of things. But I'll give you now an example that is very concrete and where I'm involved in right now. Actually, in Norway, it's probably, I don't know if it can be transferred to anything in your country. You don't have a seashore, but we have a long seashore. And one thing that happened there is this. This is one of the two parts of a sunken World War II German submarine outside our coast. It's actually very close to where I live, close to Bergen. And it was discovered just, 15 years ago or so. It's 150 meter deep, right? So it's still on the continental shelf. And there is this remain of the U-boat, which is of the submarine, is called U-864. Now, there are many such boats, many things all over. And this one also has some torpedoes still there, and this is also, many of them have. And every month there is one torpedo somewhere in the Irish Sea exploding, right? So these are things that are normal. What is not normal is with this one, it has the highest load or point source of mercury on Earth. It has roughly 67 tons of mercury in its freight. Now, this is something very special. It was, Hitler apparently thought that, it was in 45, that he thought, oh yes, he's still winning, and, but the Japanese are in trouble. So he wanted to help the poor Japanese to win the war and to build a lot of detonators for their torpedoes and stuff. And there you need mercury. Now, mercury is highly poisonous, particularly in a process where it gets to methyl mercury, right? Now, and that will happen in a surrounding when it gets out of these steel containers, where it is now. It has these, steel containers, and there are, 1,000 of them. And once it is methyl mercury, it's so poisonous, it will basically, it has the potential at least, to poison all of the North Atlantic and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and affect the whole food web, including, of course, us, who eats stuff from the sea. So, and there is no other source as big as that. We have had an accident in Japan many years ago, the Minamata accident, which was much less. But we know how poisonous that was. So, what will happen is that this is the submarine, and it will sort of have a methyl mercury in the soil, in the seafloor, and in the water, right? And from there it will spread. And particularly, you have to remember also that there is, in spite of that, we don't have a lot of earthquakes, but there is a lot of seismic activity in the oceans. This is a map of the seismic activity along the Norwegian coast. So it's not a stable situation that boat is in. So the question has been, or is still, what to do with that. And there have been basically two solutions have been discussed. The one is to cover it up, use some 100,000 tons of sand, rocks, and other stuff, and put it on top of the remaining submarine. And the other is to raise the submarine to the top, and then get the mercury out on land and have it controlled there. So these are the principal notions. And you just have to remember that Norway, as many other countries, it has also subscribed to the precautionary principle, right? So dealing with the uncertainties and all of that. So what has happened? Well, first of all, it was decided that Norway should take possession. There was a meeting with the German government many years ago, and the Norwegians said, we take part of that, we'll deal with it, right? And then the government was charged to find a solution to that. The government then charged the coastal agency to have it researched how to do and what to do and how much it costs. And there were a lot of things reported. All of the research that went into this was done by private consultancies. Some of these consultant companies were just one-man people. All of them had very specific business interests also. And in the beginning, there was a mood among politicians and even some of the consultancies to get it up. However, the coastal agency then took affairs and they said, oh, we have made a calculation. This is 3 times as expensive as covering it up, and covering up is safe enough. Nothing will happen. And then the government was in doubt, and the coastal agency was going out in public, and they were really defending this covering up solution. Now, and that was going on for some time. Last year, it was in the state budget to cover up this submarine. The community which is closest to the site, a little village of 550 people, came to us in the University of Bergen and said, hey, you have to do something about this. We have been against covering up all the time, and this is too dangerous. I mean, if it's not happening now, it will happen in the future. It will affect our children and all others. So you have to do something. And we formed an expert committee. There's one environmental toxicologist, one chemist, and me for the risk studies. We went to Parliament, and it was just before they had to decide on the budget where this was included. And we told the Parliament, we said, hey, listen, we are not telling you what to do, right? This is up to you. You have to make the value decisions. The only thing we can tell you is that the knowledge base that you have to make that decision is poor. And it's really biased, one-sided. You haven't involved a single academic environment in this. And we have letters from other international experts, from university lives and all of that, who basically say, if you cover it up, this is a catastrophe in the future, right? So we need to raise it. And so what happened is, well, basically the Parliament, then after we had 2 meetings with the groups in Parliament, they charged the ministry and said, hey, you have to do something about this. Take it out of the budget, which they did. And the ministry then asked, we had a meeting with the minister, and in spite of his administration, who hated this, they wanted to get it done with, but the minister said, okay, I give it a chance, let's have a new assessment. What he did is he again charged the agency, the Coastal Affairs Agency, to have an update on the assessments. And the Coastal Agency had then a call out for a holistic, a big assessment if there is any new evidence. And the people who should work on that had 5 weeks to do that. Of course, you cannot do anything in 5 weeks. Rumble, the biggest that we tried, and they gave a report back to this was a consultancy again. They gave a report back, which showed that there were many things that they didn't know, uncertainties. The Coastal Agency then wrote their own summing up, and the summing up had nothing to do with the report they got. It's just they said, there is no new evidence. They put in their whole prestige. They say, we have to cover it up. And now the minister had got it, and they said, well, you have to do the work again. Now it's out again to be assessed until the 1st of December. We don't know how it ends. But the problem is that what these people have been doing is they have been using a standard model, a risk assessment that you use in building bridges, right? And in these models here, you can see that long-term effects that are catastrophic but that are where you cannot have a high probability that it will happen this time or next time. Those effects are discounted, right? So that means a big environmental catastrophe in the future doesn't really count compared to, say, the probability that you may lose one life in rescuing the remains of the submarine. So this was the basis. They have never done any kind of worst-case analysis. So what we have been arguing, what I would like to see here is that we contextualize these knowledge claims, that we point out the limitations, that we tell the politicians that even the problem formulations that's done by the coastal agency was insufficient, and sort out the values and the facts, and try to extend the input in order to have a much better independence in the assessment. And this, I don't want to say much more, but this is in line with what the European Union has been doing. They have formed a science advice for policy, which is called SAPEA, and I would encourage you to look that up on the internet. There is a new report out that is called Making Sense of Science, which should give us more independence. And with that, I think I have to close. Thank you very much.